This was my longest and last trip of the year. I was gone for 5 weeks, during which time I spoke over 30 times in more than 15 churches. I started in Havana, where I expected to rent a car at the airport. There were none, so I had to spend the night and continue looking in the city the following day for one. The next day, I still could not find a car to rent. While I was eating lunch in a little restaurant, this woman came in. There were only 3 tables, which were all occupied. I invited her to my table, thinking I would have the opportunity to share the gospel with her. When she asked me what I was doing there, and I told her that I was a Christian, she literally burst into tears. She told me that she was a new Christian and that she was just returning home from her little church. She invited me to her home for coffee. People south of the Rio Grande are very, very hospitable with the very little that they may have. Anyway, she told me how God had healed her of cancer when the church prayed for her. She showed me the x-rays of her cancer and the letters from the doctors declaring her healed without surgery. She called her pastor, who invited me to speak that evening. I remember feeling, before I left Houston, that 5 weeks with all the travel and speaking was a tall mountain to climb. But when these believers began to sing, well, I wouldn't trade that for anything. As Pam explained to her friends, when Dan is in those places, he is with his people. I know she was right, because when the 5 weeks were up, I felt like I could stay another 5. I finally found a car the following day and went to Bahia Honda. The man holding the baby is the pastor there. The guy in the middle is a dependable, committed member of the church who is involved in multiple ministries. He and his wife, who is not in the picture, began to come only because their daughter begged them to come the first time. The man in the red tank top on the left knows more Bible verses from memory than any other person I know. I spoke several times that weekend. I need to tell you the story about these two. First, though, I need to tell you a little bit about the pastor's family. They have 2 older, healthy boys. One is studying to be a doctor. This younger one, however, in the pastor's arms, has some history. When he was about a month old, his eye popped out. They rushed him to the doctor, who showed them the x-rays of the tumor in the baby's head that had caused this to happen. The doctor told the parents that they would have to do surgery, of course, and that the boy would be blind in that eye, never walk, and be retarded in other ways. Surgery was scheduled for 2 days later. Well, the church began to pray immediately. By the time of the surgery, the tumor was gone. The pastor showed me the x-rays of the tumor. Today, the boy is not blind in that eye, but is still not yet walking properly, although he is improving. The mother told me of a problem she had with his school. The boy had a teacher who was very insensitive to his special needs and basically dismissive of him. The mother asked that the boy be removed to another class. He was. She told me how the new teacher was very kind and patient with him. I asked her if the new teacher was a Christian or came to church. She said no. I told her that I wanted to meet this new teacher. They took me to meet her. I shared the gospel with her, and she accepted the Lord. That brings us back to this picture. She brought her husband to church the next day, and he accepted the Lord as well. That Sunday evening, I spoke in another little church in a nearby town. The pastor also took me to visit still another church in the area that meets in this humble building. The two pastors showed me the poor conditions of the building and how small it was. From there, I went to Media Luna, several days' travel away. The pastor, in the blue and white striped shirt, took me around to rural areas to encourage Christians and evangelize unbelievers. Here's a story for you. The guy in the middle got saved several years ago. He is the most passionate evangelist type you'll ever meet. He shares the gospel with everyone. Well, his older brother finally accepted the Lord. His sister, though, was a witch. One day, recently, she accepted the Lord as well. However, she had a whole voodoo building, like this one, filled with idols of all sorts. You see these buildings all over the country. They all have high windows like this so that there is ventilation, but people still can't see in. They are always filled with idols like these. This witch had tons of them. After about a month, she agreed to burn them all. I saw the pictures of them hauling out cartloads after cartload. For this country, it represented a fortune. She still had the building, however. Several weeks later, she asked to have it torn down. It used to be in the area to the right of where you see that we're standing in this picture. They held an evangelistic campaign for 5 days in Media Luna. I spoke each evening. The man standing in the middle here accepted the Lord that first evening. He is a highly educated and very respected man in the city. The next evening, this young lady in white accepted the Lord. The next day, so did her mother. This is the piano player and his family standing in front of their humble home. He told me how he took no lessons, but just seemed to always know how to play. He says that God gave him the talent. And trust me, he plays very, very well. Here they are, all cleaned up for church. Here is a humble lady, her son, and the grandmother. While I was there for 5 days, I would take them home in the night after the service. I was shocked to find that they had walked 5 kilometers each way to come to church. And they walked through this. They explained how they had to take their shoes off before they could walk through the mud in several locations. The next meeting was Sunday morning. These 4 people accepted the Lord. Notice the girl with the blue sweater. After church, I was taking someone to a nearby town when someone recognized her walking along the road to her home about 4 miles out of town. We picked her up. I felt compelled to share the gospel with her parents, who also accepted the Lord. During those 5 days, they would take me to other villages and towns to speak in churches of all sizes and shapes. Here's one that meets outside. I was always happy to share, no matter what the size of the church. In fact, I feel more love for people like these, because who is going to reach out to them? Also, during the day, the pastor would take me to the homes of members of the church who had unbelieving spouses or children. This is a husband who accepted the Lord. His wife was already a believer. Someone told us about this woman who was searching for spiritual truth and had been receiving Jehovah's Witnesses in her home. I shared the gospel with her, and she also accepted the Lord. Whenever I say that I shared the gospel, You need to understand that it means that I shared currently fulfilling prophecy with them so that they would respect the Bible and be open to its message. Then I shared the salvation message with them. It all takes 30 to 45 minutes. The next meeting at the main church in Media Luna saw this couple accept the Lord. The last evening I was in Media Luna, they took me to still another town to preach, where they are starting still another church. Before the meeting, though, they had prepared a banquet for us. Now, a banquet here means there is more than just rice and maybe beans and maybe chicken. They slaved and prepared all day for this. It was no small thing for them to do this. In fact, those who prepared it stood at the end of the table watching us as we ate. You could tell that they felt pride with every bite we took. Let me explain who is sitting at the table. On the left is the pastor of Media Luna. At the far end is his wife. On the right is a couple who are considered missionaries. They are from this area, but are not yet pastors. They do evangelism and tend to the small groups in outlying areas that they had taken me to. Anyway, as the meal ended, it began to sprinkle. They warned me that if it rained, I would never be able to get the car out to the paved highway, which was about half a kilometer away. They advised me to take it to a home on the highway where some neighbors would let me park. I took it there. Just as I was asking the neighbors if I could leave it there, it began to pour rain. He invited me in. I began to share the gospel, of course, and you know what happened next. That's right, they both accepted the Lord. At that moment, the rain stopped, and I was able to return back to the church to preach. Just a word about the missionary couple. This is the house they live in. It is only about 10 feet wide and 20 feet long. This is the back side of the house. This is exactly the kind of people that I so desperately want to be able to help. Here they are serving the Lord, living on between $10 and $15 a month. Yet they are relentless in evangelism and serving others with no recognition or hope of meeting someone like me who might be able to encourage them with a word and a little money. Since I left work and have been doing this missionary work, 100% of the money that we have received has gone for these trips and to bless people like this. So God bless you. Trust me, you have real blessings in store for yourself that will be such a welcome surprise when you get to heaven. And if you don't believe me, consider what Paul wrote to the Thessalonians. These were Thessalonians he had led to the Lord. For what is our hope, our joy, or the crown in which we will glory in the presence of our Lord Jesus when he comes? Is it not you? I know there's a temptation to interpret that verse to mean something other than what it says, but this is what it says. From Media Luna, I went to Las Tunas. There I spoke in another small church. From there I left to return to Havana. I gave a ride to a Christian woman who has a small business making flan for restaurants. She needed little tin containers and had heard of a guy who manufactured them behind his house. The town was a little out of the way, but we went there anyway. She did her business with him, and then I asked him if I could speak with him. He obliged me. I shared the gospel with him, and 45 minutes later, he enthusiastically accepted the Lord. This guy is a surgeon that I gave a ride to. He was already a believer, and I was able to further encourage him. I have been in contact with him since. This is just a typical street in the city. Back in Havana, I spoke in 8 to 10 different churches and seminaries. These 3 accepted the Lord in this church. Notice the guy in the middle. His sister could not believe that he was even in church, much less that he had accepted the Lord. She and her husband explained how they had been witnessing to him just the day before, and he had no interest in spiritual things. But then he was confronted with currently fulfilling prophecy, and you see the result. The woman on the right is his sister. Her husband on the far right is an oncology surgeon. That is the pastor and his wife on the left. The doctor and his wife invited us to dinner. After dinner, we had the opportunity to share with the husband of the girl on the left who had come forward that morning. He accepted the Lord that evening, as did the guy on the right who had been in church that morning but had not come forward. The guy in the far end is the father of the woman of the house and is also a believer. You probably know that Ernest Hemingway used to hang out a lot here. Here are some pictures of his villa. It is now a museum. This is a store. Inside, there was alcohol, coffee, cookies, candy, and several other things, but no toilet paper. I heard that this private home often sold it, but they were out too. For a fun exercise, try going a week without it, like I did. Here is another church I preached in. I noticed how everyone was taking such careful notes, as I noticed most places. I discovered why. Not are they only interested in currently fulfilling prophecy for its sensational quality, but much, much more for its value in evangelism. You see, south of the Rio Grande, sharing the gospel is a passion for nearly every believer. That's probably why the gospel has been growing at revival levels in Latin America for the last 50 years. The lady on the left wanted me to share the gospel with her dad, who had no interest in spiritual things. He accepted the Lord. I've been in contact with him since. Here's another church I spoke in that meets on the porch of a house. Here are the 4 women who accepted the Lord that evening. There were other folks whose pictures are not included here who also accepted the Lord during this trip. I always charge the pastors and the entire churches with receiving, loving, growing these new believers into mature disciples, since that is what Jesus charged us with just before he returned to heaven. Here is the last church I spoke in. No one accepted the Lord this time. I assume they were already believers.